Welcome to Bria Technical Academy. Today I'm going to be showing you how to use the Boolean feature to make a column appear or disappear in your report. Let's start off by looking at our table. We're going to be using the employee table from the AdventureWorks 2012 database. Let's begin with our report. Add new item, click on report and add new item. Report, and we're just going to title it Boolean report. Add. And basically, what Boolean means is true or false. To simplify it, that's how we're going to be setting up our column. Do we want to see it meaning true, or do we not want to see the column false? That's the best way to think of Boolean in this instance. In most instances, it just means true or false. So we're going to add a data source. Build, actually, it's SQL Server. SQL Server, build, period for our local instance, and we want AdventureWorks 2012. Actually, type the A in the wrong spot. Actually, let's just hit the drop down. It should be the first one. Okay, AdventureWorks 2012. Let's test our connection. Good. Everything's good. Let's make sure we're still in Windows authentication instead of SQL Server authentication, which we are. Windows authentication. That's good. All right, let's grab our first data set. And this one is just to return our columns. It's going to be embedded data set from our source, data source one, which is AdventureWorks 2012. So select all from DBO employee. Oops. Where at, actually it's where employee ID equals at employee ID. And this is going to create our first parameter. Now let's create a data set for our input values for our parameter, first parameter, employee ID. It's going to be embedded again. Same data source one, which is AdventureWorks 2012. So we're going to select employee ID from DBO employee. Order by one. So we're going to get it in order when we hit the drop down. Order by one. Okay. Let's actually name our data set as well. This is employee. There we go. Now let's create a data set for our department ID. Add data set. Embedded again, data source one, which is AdventureWorks 2012. Select department ID where, from DBO dot employee. Where, no, actually there's nowhere in this. Order by, actually we don't need that either. Okay. All right, let's parameters. Okay, employee ID. Let's configure the employee ID. So we want it to be text here as our data type. And let's go for available values. want to get our values from a query, and the query and data set employee field employee ID. And next to our drop down is label field. It's going to be employee ID. Default value. Let's set up a default value so that when we look at the report, we could see something off bat. We don't really have to select something before we see something. We could set up a default. So let's specify a value for a default, add, and we're just going to use, let's see. All right, our first, like when we first go to our report, we want our default to be employee ID 1. So that's going to be our default. So let's just put 1 here. Okay. And I forgot to name this data set for department ID. So I'm just going to go ahead and name it. It's important to name your data set so you don't get mixed up. Excuse me. All right, now let's set up our parameter for our department. And we're just going to call it department ID. And next to our selection, we want, which is our prompt, we want it to be department ID, yes or no. So yes is for true. We want to see our department ID column. No is for false. We want it to go away. And data type is where we select Boolean. So Boolean, true or false. And you're going to see in a minute what I mean by the prompt that we just set up. Let's go to available values. And we want to get values from a query, which is our department data set with our department ID field. And next to our selection, we want it to be department ID, label field department ID. Our default value, let's specify a value, add, and true means that we want to see it by default. So specify true. So we're going to see it by default. And it's going to be employee ID 1 default. Let's insert a table. There we go. All right, employee ID, first name, last name, department ID. There we go. And down here where it says column groups, we already set up the true default where we see our department ID. We want to set up the false in case we want to select not to see it. So what we're going to do, we're going to click here in column groups. We're going to hit advanced mode. Let's bring this up a little bit. And as you can see, the ordinal position horizontally matches the vertical ordinal position here. So as you can see, if you want to select a column, you just find the ordinal position horizontally and match it vertically. And we're looking for department ID. So once we click on department ID, we can go over here to our properties and let's just scroll down. And where you see it says hidden, you want to select here, drop down and select expression. Now we want to set up our parameter to where we could have the column disappear, and that's going to be our parameter for our department ID. So we hit parameter here and we select department ID, and we're going to equal false. There we go. So hidden, we want to hide it when we have our Boolean feature evaluate to false. Okay, and I think it should be good to go. Just a second here. Okay, as you can see, we didn't have to select anything before we saw um, a piece of our report because we set up our default to be employee ID 1 and true meaning that we want to see our department ID. So let's see for employee ID 2, view our report. Okay, we're able to see everything. Employee ID 3, we should be able to see everything as well. And remember, thus far, our department ID Boolean has evaluated to true, meaning we want to see department ID. Now let's make it false. See what happens. And as you can see, our department ID column disappeared. Let's go to 2. And it still hasn't appeared. And that's how you set up the Boolean data type so that you can make a column appear or disappear. And that's the lesson for today. Thank you for joining Bria Technical Academy. Have a nice day.